When people hear the term climate justice, they usually think about fairness between rich and poor countries. But today, I want to talk about a different kind of climate justice, one that affects every family in the world. Intergenerational climate justice. Imagine you have children or grandchildren. By the time they reach 50 years old, the world will likely be significantly hotter than it is today. Heat waves will become more frequent, floods and droughts more severe, food insecurity more widespread. But who is responsible for creating that future? Was it those children? Or was it those grandchildren? Of course not. Most of the greenhouse gases shaping their future were emitted before they were even born. So is it fair that they will have to live with the consequences? This is where intergenerational climate justice begins. Those who are expected to bear the greatest burden of climate change are often among those least responsible for the emissions that caused it. And this pattern isn't unique to future generations. It's the same injustice we already see today between the global north and the global south. Many countries in the global south have contributed far less to historical greenhouse gas emissions. Yet, they are already experiencing some of the worst impacts of climate change. Floods, droughts, food insecurity, extreme heat. Meanwhile, many wealthier countries that produce a much larger share of those emissions have greater resources to protect themselves and recover from disasters. Scientists often explain this using the idea of the carbon budget. If you want to limit global warming and avoid the most dangerous impacts of climate change, there's only a limited amount of carbon dioxide humanity can still emit. Think of it as a shared budget. Every ton of CO2 we emit today leaves less available for everyone who comes after us. In other words, every generation leaves a smaller carbon budget for the next. And because carbon dioxide remains in the atmosphere for decades, sometimes even centuries, the emissions we produce today will continue shaping people's lives long into the future. If we visualize this across generations, it looks something like this. If people live to about 80 years old, here's how different generations are likely to experience climate change during their lives. These green ones represent the older generations who were born before around 1960. For example, if someone was born in 1950, they would turn 80 in 2030. And if they were born in 1960, they would turn 80 in 2040. This means that most of their lives have been spent before the most severe impacts of climate change. Next, these blue ones represent the middle generations who were born between around 1960 and 2000. They are living through a period when the impacts of climate change are becoming increasingly severe. And finally, these red ones represent the younger generations who were born in or after around 2000. They are likely to spend most of their lives in a world that is at least 2 degrees Celsius warmer if current trends continue. As you can see, the younger you are today, the longer you are likely to live with the consequences of today's emissions. Climate change doesn't affect every generation equally. It becomes more severe over time. The later you are born, the harsher the world you are likely to inherit. At the same time, many people from older generations experience decades of economic growth and rising living standards, while younger generations are inheriting the escalating consequences of the emissions that helped to drive that growth. So how did we get here? For decades, success has often been measured by economic growth, greater convenience, and higher profits. And there's no denying that these things have improved our lives. People are living longer, technology has transformed the way we live and communicate, and living standards have risen around the world. But these achievements have also come with environmental costs. The more we consume, the more resources we use. The more resources we use, the more greenhouse gases we emit. In many ways, today's climate change is a result of decades of choices that prioritize short-term prosperity while overlooking long-term environmental consequences. For many people, life follows a familiar path. Work hard, raise a family, save for retirement. Then after your children become independent, enjoy the years you've worked for. Travel, spend time with your friends and family, pursue your hobbies. If your children need help, you'll always be there. But otherwise, you've earned the right to focus on your own life. There's nothing wrong with that. In many ways, that's what most people hope for. But climate change forces us to ask a difficult question. Does our responsibility really end there? Or do we also have a responsibility to the generations who will live with the consequences of today's choices long after we are gone? Now, when people talk about future generations, they often imagine people who have not yet been born. But many of the people who will experience the worst effects of climate change are already alive today. Today's children, today's teenagers, today's younger adults. They're not speaking only for future generations. They're speaking for themselves. Just as many communities in the global south have had to raise their voices because they are already living with the consequences of a crisis they did little to create. Younger generations have every reason to do the same. Because they are the ones who will live longest with the consequences of the decisions being made today. But there's one important difference. People living on the front lines of climate change can already see the impacts with their own eyes. By contrast, many young people don't yet realize how serious the situation is, not because the risks aren't real, but because they are still being told mostly about the future, rather than the carbon budget that is disappearing today, and the decisions that are already shaping the world they will inherit. Without understanding the scale and urgency of the problem, it's difficult to demand change. And without those voices, it becomes much easier for society to ignore the problem. But once people understand what's at stake, those voices become much harder to ignore, because climate justice isn't only about fairness between countries. It's also about fairness between generations. The people who will live longest with the consequences of today's decisions deserve a voice in shaping those decisions. Maybe that's one of the biggest climate justice challenges of our time.